Hi, I'm Peshek here with Peshek Farms in Mountain View, Oklahoma. I've been here 6 years now in Oklahoma. I'm a beginning farmer, and I've started a cow-calf operation, sheep, goats, pastured pigs, and a chicken business as well on my farm. I'm going to talk today a little bit about regenerative ag and what regenerative ag means for me. I moved to Oklahoma in 2016. Reason being, I had opportunity to start in the cattle business down here. I grew up in Nebraska. I didn't have a family farm to really go back to, but I really had a passion in farming. And so I started from scratch through partnerships and working with people. I also worked for a cover crop seed company at the time, and they also worked with me, helping get started, and was very flexible. And so that allowed me to build my own farm and get to where I am today. But even when I got here, I still had a limited amount of acres as an operation, something that I couldn't necessarily do full time when I got started. But now, as of the end of 2021, I am full time on my own farm. I have a meat business as well, and so that's what really drove me to regenerative ag. What does regeneration mean to me? For me, regeneration involves the ability to identify a depleted resource and adapt our management to improve that specific resource. In this case, we're talking about soil and water resources. For me, on the land that I manage today, water infiltration has been very huge. I have very heavy clays in parts of my farm. And then other areas I have heavy slopes with gravelly sand. And so catching that water, holding the water, and utilizing it for productivity and ending up with a end product has been very important to me. And so our management has highly relied on focusing different animals or even different techniques on different areas of the land to improve that productivity and result be more profitable on the same acres as well. So that's what regeneration is to me. In 2017 is when I started up, so not too long ago. I started with 25 head of cows. I grazed stockpiled cover crops for winter feed, and I highly focused on a zero hay or protein for the first winter. I had zero equipment, and so I didn't have ways to handle feed. I used hot wire and electric fence to move the cattle in high density and manage their grazing, and they did very well, and it worked out great for me. I capped out on the cover crops, and then in the early 2018 I worked into the spring grasses in the perennial pastures. And so on my operation that I'm going to talk about today is a lot of the key focuses that were important to me when I started. One was being no-till on the farmland. I was a big believer in that. But even more to go along with that, I know a lot of people may scoff a little bit at no-till because they're heavily relying on commercial fertilizers or chemicals, and I really wanted to be a advocate of other ways of doing no-till and trying things different. And so I've went zero dewormers in the livestock to promote dung beetle activity and earthworms. These two insects or biology, better describe them, is going to improve the water infiltration in our water systems, and in the long term will help our productivity on the land. And as you can see behind in the back picture, there is a dung beetle hole going through the soil that comes from manure pats. And so getting that animal impact there, getting the dung beetles there and the earthworms there, can really help our water infiltration. And so that was one big focus with the livestock systems that I was working on. Anything on the pasture land that I was taking over or farmland, I wasn't going to use commercial fertilizers, and I still don't. I use very diverse cover crops if I'm going to plant something. Legume species are one of my favorite because they are going to build fertility in the soil with time, and use those resources versus buying them directly. I also focused heavily on grazing management, rotating the cattle frequently when I started, and managing for more rest. I also focused on animal genetics to match my management and location. That was really key to me if I was going to be successful at raising livestock with very little equipment. I needed genetics and animals that was going to match my system, and so I still believe that's very important. And then improving soil functions such as water infiltration and holding capacity. I can't say that enough, how crucial that is. If a person was to use commercial fertilizers, they're still limited by the rainfall in our area. Being on dry land, we're still limited by rainfall and water holding capacity, even if you've put all the fertilizer out in the world. I don't, but it's still going to dictate the biology. It's going to dictate the use of any fertilizers if you choose to use them. And so it's been a very big key point in my operation. In 2018, starting out in my first year, these were some of kind of my results. I was able to increase my average stocking capacity by 33% on the same number of acres. Basically, I was comparing to the average in the area on the stocking rate. But because I was rotating so frequently and I was adding diversity into my systems, not having monocultures of Bermuda grass or not having monocultures of a grass stand, I was able to extend my grazing seasons drastically, but also rest the land and provide plenty of residue. How I seeded a lot of these diverse things was either broadcasting. I have rented a drill in the past, and then in the bottom left corner you've seen I've bought myself a little 6-row no-till planter, which is a lot cheaper than a no-till drill, for getting that diversity into the pastures. So even though there's 30 inches apart, still serves the purpose of getting that diversity into that pasture, and it's worked really well for me. Also, I haven't sprayed any weeds in the pastures. On the cropland, I have done terminations before. In the last year, I have not, as I'm trying to get away from chemicals entirely. And so when I've overseeded warm season perennials, these are some of the species that I've used and found that have worked really good for me in this part of the state. Alfalfa, vetches, clovers, particularly yellow sweet clover, has worked well. Chicory, plantain, small burnet, peas. And so you also see I do add a few grasses into it, but in a lot of cases of where I took over, it was a monoculture of grasses, and so I did not feel like mimicking nature was to add more grasses to that system. Legumes also like a nitrogen starved scenario, and so it's hard to go grass on grass without starving out one of your crops. And so using one that builds nitrogen or builds fertility really worked well in my system. And so all these plants added fertility to soil, added food for the biology, specifically the earthworms that we've seen in these systems. You can kind of see here on the top right hand corner where I've been overseeding into Bermuda grass. We're getting 10, 12, 15 earthworms per shovelful, which is awesome because in a lot of areas where I didn't overseed and I've just done the grazing management, for instance, in the bottom left corner, we're only getting 1 to 2 earthworms per shovelful. So we're drastically increasing our water infiltration, our water holding capacity by interseeding these legumes and broadleaves into the grass systems. And you can kind of see on the bottom right hand side of the depth of the topsoil color has changed. That's only been a year and a half. It was solid red starting out. You couldn't get a shovel in the ground. It was so hard. It went from being very hard, like the top left corner picture, to the bottom right in about a year and a half, 2 years. And what's happening here is we have a lot of carbon in the system that's available. It's just that the biology can't digest it all because there's no organic nitrogen, and the previous management before was just applying commercial fertilizers, which did not work for the biology at all. And so once we got the organic nitrogen in there through legumes, the earthworms drastically blew up, and we saw that top layer build very drastically. In 2019, I was able to buy a farm of my own to kind of stabilize my operation. I bought a farm in Mountain View. I was at Apache for a little while. It's 240 acres of diverse ecosystems and soils. And it involves creeks, uplands, bottomlands, everything from heavy clay soils to gravelly sands on the hillsides. It has 120 acres of cropland, 15 acres of trees, and creek bottom, and about 105 acres of what I would refer to as degraded native pasture with some Bermuda. And the reason I say that is the topsoil in a lot of these slopes and pastures is 1 inch or less, that where you start to get into rock. And so it's been something that we've highly been focusing on, is getting water storage and water holding capacity on these native pastures. 2020, a year of change. A lot of people can think back what they were doing in 2020 with COVID, but that didn't affect us directly. But we still had plenty of changes and adaptability that we had to do here. One was improving diversity and fertility. I got into the pastured pigs, which also worked out really well. During the COVID instances, I started a meat business based off of them. And it's something that's growing well, and I hope to continue to grow. The nice thing about the pastured pigs is they're very productive. We do supplement them with barley and non-GMO feed out on the pasture, and so we're bringing fertility in through the feed, and the animals are converting it back to an organic fertilizer for these pastures. A lot of people talk about pigs destroying land. A lot of cases, it depends on the area and the timing and the management of pigs. We rotate frequently with the pigs. 14 to 20 days is where I range from, and we allow for a long rest. And then I also overseed grasses or cover crops into the disturbed areas. This is a great opportunity to diversify a system, opening up some of the canopy in areas that are more of a monoculture. I feed native grass seeds through their feed, so it passes through their manure, and it's basically a starter pack for native grasses. Sheep and goats have been a great add as well. We started that in 2020, taking advantage of overgrown creeks with brush and converting them to profitability. We've been reducing some of the tree stands of brushy trees, trying to recreate a silvopasture in the creek bottoms by thinning the trees and selecting good trees and adding grasses back in the creek bottoms to reduce the water erosion. That's happening right in the creek bottoms. It was a great add because we could stack this on top of the cattle and not take away any land resources away from the cattle business in 2020. So here's some of the pictures. In the top left picture is sheep and goats. Great opportunity. Is actually a failed alfalfa stand that turned to some weeds. Again, we're getting completely away from chemicals and matching an enterprise to our resource concerns. And in this scenario, I have a really thick stand of mare's tail, which is a common crop weed, but with sheep and goats, it's great feed. So we're turning weeds into money. We're eliminating expense and creating a profit by changing the management to our resources. And that's been big for us for the part of regenerative agriculture, is adapting to the scenarios that we have versus using chemical inputs to recreate a scenario that we want. The bottom left is actually where I've been running pigs from the get-go for 2 years now, over 2 years now. And you can see that the stands of grasses have become really thick. This is on very shallow soils. You get into rock that's about 1 to 2 inches from the soil surface. There was hardly any grass there when we started. And now the grass stands have been really thick because of the added fertility and the rest that the pigs have provided. And I highly believe the way they do disturb the soil allows for new seedlings to get established well, including flowering plants and pollinators. We're actively trying to get the pastured pigs over more areas of the land. And you can see on the right hand side, there are areas that I do seed cover crops in at times of the year where they disturb and provide extra forage, but get that ground covered back up more importantly. A lot of the areas that they do disturb are around the feeder, around the water tank. Being out in the range, unless it gets really, really wet and they find something, they hardly do much damage out on the range in the pasture. And so, but we just kind of observe and we adapt with the hogs. 2021, in 2020 we had a major problem with grasshoppers that destroyed a lot of grass. They destroyed some of my fruit trees that I established. a lot of people were spraying, and for me it would cost about $3,600 to spray my property for grasshoppers, and I just didn't see that I wanted to give away that money. And I remember one of my grandfather's stories from the Great Depression was they used turkeys to chase grasshoppers. That was one of his most profitable deals during the Great Depression, was raising turkeys, chasing the grasshoppers. And so in a similar way, I found a deal on chickens to where we take in what I call refurbished chickens from laying houses and bring them in and run them on the land, and I put them in mobile carts and we chase the grasshoppers with them. And these hens are actively laying when we get them, and so I actually started a business. People started asking for chickens for their backyards, and so I started a business off of this, and I profited this year about $6,000 off of 1,500 chickens. And so it was a nice paycheck versus a cost for my business and my farm. The other thing that we've done as of recently, utilizing bale grazing with stocker calves to add profitability and fertilizer to the land while increasing the water infiltration on the slopes and bare land. I first started out, I was really big against feeding hay, but feeding hay in the right spots can be very, very beneficial to drastically improving that condition of the soil and the productivity of it when managed properly. But being a cow-calf operation, it still is a bottom line expense. And as of recently, we went more to a stocker calf to take advantage of some hay and feed out on the land and make a profit off of feeding hay out on the land. And so not only we're improving the soil, but we've created a profit scenario. Utilizing the pastured pigs still to spread native seeds throughout the pasture. I've added partridge peas, native legumes as well, trying to improve the wildlife habitat, things that are good for quail and other birds and our pollinators. That's something that I always keep in the back of mind of what are things that are being affected on our farms unintentionally, and I'm trying to improve those resource concerns as well. Utilizing the goats and sheep to thin the brush in the creek bottoms. And then lastly, we're focused on raising high quality food for the consumer. These are some of our pork chops that we raise off the pastured pigs. They're marbled. They're some of the best pork chops I've ever had, and I'm not saying that as I didn't realize there was such a difference between pasture proteins and what we were getting out of the store when I was growing up, but now I drastically realize the difference, and we're marketing it to the consumer that way as well as an entirely different product. You can see here some of the pictures of our operation here. Here's the goats in the creek bottoms where I'm thinning trees. I'm culling brushy or waste trees and reducing the stand of trees so there's more sunlight to the soil, and interseeding cover crops and grasses in the bottom to actively get going. And so in a lot of these cases it's overgrown, sunlight can't get to the soil, and so there's very few grass roots or plants in the creek bottoms that can hold the soil together when it floods. And so I'm trying to get more grass roots into those creek bottoms. On the right is pastured pigs, just a scenario that we're in of, we're grazing and adding other species into their feed. You can see they really enjoy the green grass there. So this happened recently, I was talking about earlier. This was the end of October. we got hammered by a hailstorm. And this is the big thing for me about why I like regenerative agriculture and why it's so important for my operation is it's opened a lot of gateways of being adaptable and flexible, and you just never can plan for some things, and this is one of them. And overnight, I lost 400 acres of forage due to a hailstorm, and you can see it laid it over. It stripped a lot of the leaves off. We did get some bounce back, but it creates a definitely different management plan overnight. And so within 2 weeks, I've sold my cow-calf operation and went more stocker calves, and we're bale grazing out on these areas. Immediately, here you can see the stocker calves that we're bringing in. We're bale grazing, getting residue out there. But we're also seeding underneath while we're bale grazing too. We're adding diversity, and we're getting that biology jump started hopefully on these areas. And so you can see clovers coming up. We're also combining the stockers and the sheep together to get more hoof traffic to trample on the seed and get better seed soil contact. There's a lot of these areas you can't get a drill in, so we had to broadcast into these areas. And lastly, these are some of the projects that we're doing involving water. I'm adding dugouts into the waterways to slow water activity. So when we do get those flooding rains, we're slowing that water down before it even gets to the creek. We're adding wildlife habitat to our system. I can't remember the exact number, but I believe the average surface water in the U.S. used to be about 8%, and it's about 1%. And so I try to keep that number in mind on my own farm of how can I get 8% surface water on the land and rehydrate the landscape. And so it's not just holding the water in the soil sometimes, it's also holding it up on the landscape so we can hydrate our cash crops or our livestock downhill from there. And so I've been adding dugouts into waterways that they're just shallow, they slow the water down, but they'll create a pool, and then it'll allow for grazing management based off of these areas at different times of the year. You know, these will go dry at certain times of the year, but when there's water in them, we can rotate off of them and change our grazing plans to utilize them and better graze certain areas of the farm. And here's my contact info if you have any questions, but this is a little bit about my farm and what I've done and what I work with and hope to continue to keep doing. So thank you. Bye.